let's talk about some fight phase tactics when you're fighting multiple combats at once. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're talking about the fight phase once again, and the really big swings that you can get in 9th edition by allowing your units to strike before the opponents can. In the video we'll talk about the counter-offensive stratagem and why it's so good, followed by a whole host of ways that you can play around it and try and stop your opponents from cutting down your charging units right in their moment of glory. If you have a reasonable amount of assault units in your army, there's every chance that you're going to be charging in multiple combats across the board. Say for example here with a Space Marine player and we're charging our Blade Guard veterans into some Mega Knobs and some Terminators into a bunch of Squighog boys. Both of the units that we're engaging are really quite dangerous in melee, and if the orcs happen to strike first for whatever reason, they could do some serious damage to our charging units before they even get to strike. The counter-offensive stratagem is a really common way of being able to do so, and I'd say for the 2 command points that you invest in it, is often one of the best returns that you can get on your CP throughout the game. If your unit is just about to be wiped out by a charging enemy unit, you potentially spend 2 command points to do some great damage to the enemy models, and potentially you might even save your own models' lives, because for every enemy model that you kill, you're going to be reducing incoming damage on your unit. Perhaps the best use of it is when a very hard-hitting but fragile enemy unit charges one of yours. Ideally, if you could wipe out that hard-hitting unit before they fight, then you've killed one scary enemy threat, saved one of your own threats and have it free for next turn, and it's only cost you 2 command points. It does make it kind of tricky when you're charging multiple scary enemy units across the board. Say in the example below, if we fight with the Blade Guard, then the Orc player is likely to interrupt with the Squighogs, and the other way round if we fight with the Terminators first. Perhaps the Marines with their Storm Shields could tank the incoming damage, but a few bad rolls and he could be left only with the tattered remnants of a squad that's not going to be able to wipe out the Orcs that they charged. So let's talk about a few ways that you can play around counter-offensive. First up, when it comes to your charge and fight phase, I would check if your opponent actually has 2 command points left. They're almost certainly going to in the first few turns, but in the later turns it's a bit less likely, as it usually makes sense to spend the majority of your command points early in the game to get an early advantage. I'd also be aware of any pop-up fights last abilities that your opponent might have, which could basically function the same way. Say with Abmech Electro Priests, they could just make any enemy unit fight last within engagement range, so could kind of function as a free interrupt for them. Obviously though, if your opponent doesn't have the command points and none of those abilities, then it means that you don't have to worry about this too much and you can be fairly free with your combats. Next, I'd strongly think about using the shooting phase to help out your charge phase, particularly if your units are going to be quite close and pretty capable of making the charge no matter how much you shoot the enemy. If you think that the interrupt could be a really big deal to one of your relatively fragile melee units, it might make sense to dedicate a bit of firepower to one of the targets that you're charging, so that if the opponent does try and use counter-offensive, then it's not likely to be all that valuable. For this example, maybe you could see early on that your Blade Guard had a really easy charge on the Mega Knobs, so in the shooting phase you might dedicate a bit of firepower to them, maybe kill 1 or 2 out of the unit, plan to fight with the Terminators first in melee, and then if the opponent does interrupt with the Mega Knobs, it might not matter all that much, just because they don't have quite as much damage as they would have before. Obviously you do want to be careful about not shooting yourself out of a charge. If you attack a really big enemy unit and your charge is kind of long, they will be pulling casualties from the front, and you really don't want to not make a charge because you happen to have shot yourself out of range. Next up, to make this sort of game easier, you could ensure that at least some of your units are ridiculously tough to take out, either in army construction or with in-game mechanics like psychic powers or stratagems. Basically, if you could make one of your charging Space Marine units so tough that it really doesn't care too much about being interrupted against, then that's going to make your decisions a lot easier and your opponent much harder. I think that's potentially one of the values of taking a really big hefty melee unit. Say if you did take a big 10-man Terminator squad all with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, it does mean that if you're interrupted against, sure they might kill the same amount of models as they would have anyway, but it's still very likely that you're going to have enough models left to wipe out the enemy unit afterwards, even if you take a casualty or 2. Otherwise, you could think about using a defensive buff. Maybe you could think about striking first with the Terminators, and then plan to use transhuman physiology on the Blade Guard, so those Mega Knob power claws aren't anywhere near as effective against them. There's all sorts of defensive buffs like that throughout the game, either psychic powers that grant feel no pain type saves, or things like Eldar getting -1 to hit when they're attacked. Obviously it does depend a bit on exactly what you've charged, it won't always help you if you've charged something really nasty. Next, and perhaps one of the most reliable and powerful ways to stop the interrupt, is by using one of the Fights Last mechanics, which almost every codex seems to be getting access to in the new 9th edition rules. Fights Last abilities are typically worded that your unit is no longer eligible to fight until all others have done so, and this means that you can't use the counter-offensive stratagem on them, so it basically gets rid of that entire counterplay strategy. Say for example, if the Blade Guard did happen to have a Judicia nearby, you know that those Mega Knobs are going to be fighting last, so you could safely strike with the Terminators, and then mop up with the Blade Guard after, knowing that the Mega Knobs aren't going to be striking before them. It's a really quite common mechanic to include in quite a lot of armies now. The Death Guard have their Revolting Stench Vats, the Admech have their Electro Priests and Tech Priest characters, Drukhari can get it on their Archons or Homunculi, Space Wolves can take the armor of Russ, and Dark Angels have the psychic power Mindworm. If you've got a decent amount of melee units, it is really quite handy to have these along in some form if you can field them. It can sometimes be the difference between winning 2 combats across the map as opposed to winning 1 and then getting interrupted against. Next up, you could just go with the strategy of overloading the enemy with so many combats that it doesn't make too much difference if they win 1. If you've got lots of fast, hard-hitting melee units, you could maybe charge all sorts of units across the map, fight with the most important one first, know that your opponent is going to use counter-offensive somewhere and you will lose something, but then after that you've got all of the rest of the combats to go, and you'll hopefully be striking first in all of them. If you're getting charges off everywhere, then it is likely going quite well for you already, but it does mean that if you do know that an interrupt is coming, you can maybe be a little bit more liberal with the charges after that. Otherwise, if you really can't play around it too cleverly, then obviously just select the most optimal unit first. You really need to decide which combat you most need to win, and which one might be the single most painful one if your opponent were to pull an interrupt. Out of the 2 combats here, I think I'd be more tempted to fight with the Blade Guard first against those Mega Knobs. With all those Power Sword attacks, they do have a fair chance of killing them, and even if the Squighog boys do interrupt and attack the Terminators first, I suspect that with the size of the squad, we're likely going to have enough Terminators to finish them off anyway. Sometimes it can be a bit of a tricky decision though, you're both weighing up how much damage your opponent can do, and also which combats you most need to succeed. Generally though, if you have a strong hard-hitting melee unit that's likely to get wiped out if it gets interrupted, then it's normally going to be a go-to to fight with first. Finally, and perhaps at the very worst, if you're really sure that your opponent is going to interrupt and kill a unit, it might just not be worth charging in the first place. Say if you had 2 very hard-hitting but very fragile melee units, perhaps a couple of units of Sisters of Battle Repentia, and the only things that they could charge would be 2 enormous melee units on different sides of the table. If they both charge, then almost certainly one will wipe out its target, and then the other is just going to die as it gets interrupted against the enemy unit, and they even get a bit of movement out of it too as they get to pile in and consolidate. In that case, it might genuinely be better not to charge in the first place, as at the very least then you still have one of your units on the board that your opponent has to deal with in their turn, so they might be blocking movement and at least force your opponent to dedicate some shooting and maybe a charge to them, when otherwise that scary melee units might have gone off to hunt other things. I'd certainly say that that's usually the exception rather than the rule, and hopefully you'd be able to decide that ahead of time, so you just didn't try and move 2 units into charge range if one of them's just going to get interrupted and die. But still, it can sometimes mean that it's not always worth charging in the first place. To be honest, Repentia were a fairly bad example for that. They do have a fights and death stratagem, so you can be fairly liberal about throwing them into combat, but I think the point still stands for other units that don't have that kind of option. So let me know what you think then, and if there's anything else that I missed around the counter-offensive stratagem and fighting multiple combats across the board. Look forward as always to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k Tactics videos coming, with new ones coming out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying my videos quite a bit, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.